Hello, everyone. This is being brought to you by the Content Club, a club where historians, archaeologists, television producers, and history fans come together to try and work in a new and collaborative way to make great television documentaries. And I'm joined today, I'm pleased to say, by Dr. Miles Russell of the Durotriges project. And we go a long way back, but even before then, you go a long way back as an archaeologist, you've been telling me. So where did it all start for you, your love of archaeology?
I think I've always, been interested in the past. Thankfully, I grew up in Brighton, with the South Downs just behind me, with loads of visible earthworks around barrows, hill forts, and so on there. And my parents took me, my brother, and sister when we were on holiday to various stately homes, castles, long barrows, Roman villas. So their enthusiasm about the past really sort of filtered down significantly to us. And I was sort of distinctly remember being at primary school, when you're at that early formative age, when you study the Romans. I say sort of study, you sort of you're drawing pictures and you're sort of and doing kinds of activities, but sticking little foil bottle tops to pictures of Romans and colouring things in. And it was about the same time that the Asterix books were first being translated into English in the early 70s, and it that all came together and really sort of infused me for studying the past and certainly sort of thinking about the Romans. When I was 11 or 12, I managed to get onto an archaeological dig and realised that you don't have, it's not just a case of studying and seeing these places. You can dig down into the past and you can discover pottery and flint and things that people haven't seen for thousands of years. And it was that electric thrill of discovery, I think, that hooked me and has stuck with me ever since. And archaeology claimed me from that point onwards.
So you were always going to be an archaeologist. 12, 13 years ago, we got Digging for Britain commissioned on BBC Two. We didn't really know how we were going to make it or what we were going to find, but we were committed to trying to open up the world of archaeology. And you were among one of the very first people that we came to. And the Durotriges project was more or less in its infancy at that time.
Yes. 2009 we started the project, and 2010 when you came to visit us. So yes, we were very much in the formative stages. We were starting to make discoveries, but we still were unaware, I think, of just how significant those discoveries would prove to be.
And explain to us a little bit. I mean, there's various forms of archaeology. You're a research archaeologist attached to Bournemouth University. So how does the project come to be?
Well, we're not a sort of, in the commercial world where you get lots of developer funded projects investigating sites before they're destroyed. But we obviously, we're not in that realm. But our major purpose at Bournemouth is primarily a practical archaeology program. So we're teaching students, undergraduates, how to survey sites, how to identify them, then how to archaeologically investigate them, to excavate, to record, to process finds, to do environmental sampling. So we're very much keen every year that we have a 5 or 6 week training program, that we've got a good site to get our students and the public out to, and to get them trained up, but also to enthuse them about the nature of archaeological discovery. And of course, it's key to have a good site and to have a good research question. So really what we started with the Durotriges project was to try and investigate aspects of the Iron Age into Roman transition, because we know Iron Age Britain becomes part of the Roman Empire in the mid 1st century AD. But the actual mechanics of that, what's happening to people on the ground, do people willingly accept the Romans? Do they actively resist them? These are all things we don't really know for sure. So the project was tied in to answer a very specific research question, but also to provide training. So in that sense, it's actually funded by the university, because the sites that we're looking at aren't threatened by development. They're being ploughed. They're part of an archaeological landscape, but they're not under immediate threat. So they're not the type of site that a developer-funded project would look at, but they are the type of site that's giving us a real understanding of the Iron Age past.
And when you started the project, did you kind of expect to get 1 or 2 or 3 years maybe out of the site? What happened?
Our intention was, the first site we were looking at, it was the landowner, Rebecca Hill, came to us as we were looking for sites and was saying that she'd made finds during ploughing, but we realised, mapping her land onto the ground, that there'd been no real archaeological discoveries made anywhere in this zone north of Bear Regis to sort of northeast of Dorchester. It was a blank canvas as such. So we put our students in there and they were doing geophysical surveys and they were finding all kinds of things. But ideally, we were going to go on that one site for 1 year, move to another site and just keep dropping into different places into Dorset. But we discovered fairly quickly that this site was amazing. Every single field has got major archaeological deposits in it. And so we've really been there the last 13. I mean, we could be there for the next 200 years. There is so, we've got to be an end to the project at some point, but there is so much coming up, and every single site is giving us a new understanding of the Bronze and Iron Age past. So we've been there all this time. I don't know how much longer we'll be there, but certainly it's still producing significant archaeology.
And I mean, what did you expect to find? What was the key question that you were exploring? Whether it was a peaceful transition or a warlike transition?
It is. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning that the Durotriges are the name that we understand the Iron Age tribe in Dorset and southern Wiltshire. That's the name that the Romans gave them. But the only time the tribe really appears in any modern history of Roman Britain is we get this sort of account of the Romans arriving AD 43, marching westwards across Hampshire and into Dorset. They encounter the Durotriges, who at that point are in their large, well-defended, multiple ramparted hill forts like Maiden Castle and Hod Hill and Hambledon Hill, these really big, significant hill fort enclosure sites. And battles are fought and people are slaughtered, and the Romans eventually win. They drag the survivors down, they wash them, shave them, shove them into towns, and these people gradually become Roman. And it's a very clear-cut, black and white story with no sort of nuance to it at all. And we sort of realized that invasions aren't really like that. Some people side with the enemy, some people do fight against them actively, some are passively resist. And we were starting to look more and more at the evidence, and there's really this sort of realization that hill forts like Maiden Castle, it's clear they were going out of use a good 100 years before the Romans arrived. When the Romans were here, these weren't big, still defended enclosures. I mean, there may have been fighting in and around them, but it's relatively small scale. But the view that we get of sieges and battles and sort of gradual conquest is completely wrong. So what we wanted to do was to find some good Iron Age sites of the time to try and work out, well, what were the people doing when the Romans arrived? Is there any evidence that these small-scale farming settlements were destroyed? Did they carry on? Is there evidence of continuity? And what we're seeming to find at the moment is that if we didn't know historically that the Romans arrived, we wouldn't be able to really tell it archaeologically, because we've got lots of little farming settlements that are there in the 1st century BC. They're still there in the 3rd century AD. They're gradually acquiring a few more Roman objects, pottery and so on, but there's no sudden change in the archaeology. It's almost as if they are ignoring the Roman. The Romans are here, and they're obviously, the people are living in part of a larger empire, and they're paying their tax to someone in a toga. But there's no significant break really between the Iron Age and the early Roman period. And that's more interesting, I think, from our perspective. And we're finding more evidence about the nature of society. It's small scale, it's scattered. The burials that we're recovering, we're finding more evidence that it's women who seem to have the status goods, the jewelry, the mirror, all metal sort of artifacts, large scale potteries. Male burials seem to be quite empty of artifacts. So it could be we've got more a matriarchal society rather than a patriarchal. The Romans are very clear that the Britons are barbaric because women and men have equal status. They just don't understand. They don't get that. And what we're finding with the Durotriges is probably archaeological evidence that is true. It's probably women who are holding the power and the status, and perhaps the men are more sort of transitory within that landscape. But we've got lots and lots of smaller scale settlements, and we're starting to really understand the nature of society because we're getting burials. That is really key to our understanding of Iron Age Britain.
It's something that's never, the pennies drop, because probably I'm a bit dim, but what makes Iron Age archaeology so fascinating is it does crisscross with Roman and written records. So you do have some kind of a timeline that you're trying to fit your finds into.
Yes, and we're always trying to get away from that Roman written evidence, because it is frustrating that the Iron Age Britons didn't record things themselves, so we never get their perspective about what they felt about the Romans, or what was happening to them. And the Roman accounts are extremely biased. They're very keen, because it's written for a Roman audience, and a Roman audience doesn't want the facts. They want to hear that the Britons are painted blue. They want to hear that they stick horse urine in their hair to make it stand up. They want to hear that they commit acts of human sacrifice, because that makes them alien and barbaric and savage. And it justifies the Roman invasion, because the Romans are bringing civilization to these poor, benighted souls. So we're trying to get away from the written accounts and get a better understanding of the people themselves. And of course, the great thing about working in Dorset is the Durotriges are very unusual. When we look at most Iron Age tribes across Britain, we don't get a large amount of burials, and we don't know why that is. It might be that they are placing their dead in rivers or bogs or swamps, or they're cremating their dead and scattering the ashes. But in Dorset, the Durotriges bury their dead. So we get inhumations, we get skeletons. And we get skeletons in cemeteries, about sort of 20 or 30 people in little discrete cemeteries. And for us, that's fantastic, because irrespective of whether they're buried with anything, when you get the skeletons, you can understand how old were people when they died, what injuries did they suffer in life, what was their nutrition like, because you can look at the isotopes, you can work out where people came from, whether they grew up on the chalk or whether they came from somewhere else. And suddenly, from this small part of Britain, the evidence is giving us a better understanding of society in the late Iron Age, the populations, evidence that we just really don't get anywhere else in the country. So for us, that is the draw to digging late prehistory in Dorset.
And we were talking earlier about Maiden Castle, one of the iconic, most famous battle sites, is how I've always grown up thinking of it. But I think that your work and stuff that's coming out now is starting to suggest that it's a bit more nuanced than that.
It is. I mean, it's one of the things, every single archaeological discovery changes our perception of the past, but some understandings of the past, some ways in which the past has been interpreted, remain fixed. And the Battle of Maiden Castle is one of those things, because it's presented, it's really thanks Mortimer and Tessa Wheeler were digging Maiden Castle Hill Fort in the 1930s, and after Tessa Wheeler died, Mortimer sort of took over, and in the last season of the excavations there in 1936, he uncovered what he describes as a war cemetery. I mean, what we would look at now, it's a fairly classic sort of late Iron Age burial ground, but he discovered about 50 odd skeletons, about 17 of which had evidence of cranial trauma. They'd been hit on the back of the head. They had wounds. They died violently. And he interpreted that as a war cemetery. And of course, 1936, Europe is about to descend into one of the sort of worst and most traumatic wars ever. And people are worried about invasion and what a militaristic society can do to a civilian population. And so his discovery and the way, he presented it masterfully. He got all major coverage in all the newspapers. We got newsreel footage of the time, but he presented this story of a Roman attack, savage slaughter of a native population, and he describes the Britons crawling out of their burning huts when the Romans are gone, burying their dead, and then disappearing into history. It is really evocative stuff, and it sticks with people. And although it's not a very pleasant story, it is dramatic. But what we're finding, looking at those burials now, they didn't all die in one event. Of the 50 burials, they seem to cover quite a broad span of time, from the Middle Iron Age to the Late Iron Age into the Roman period. So about 100, 200 years worth of burials. So unless the Romans took a long time to attack the hill fort, what we're seeing are people who died at different events, and they're being buried in the eastern entrance. Now, some of them may have died because the Romans killed them. They might be judicial executions and things, but it's a much more nuanced cemetery. The evidence that Neil Sharples and others have found in Maiden Castle suggests that it went out of use about 100 BC. So there is really no archaeological evidence for this battle. And it's one of those things that archaeology, the story may change again with more discoveries, but at the moment we can sort of safely say that battle probably didn't happen. And that's upsetting to people, because people grow up with this, especially around Dorchester, because they grow up with this story, with this account. And for an archaeologist to say, actually, we don't think it happened, it can be rather traumatic and upsetting. But we have to go with what the archaeology says, because the historical accounts are ultimately fallible. They're written by one side, and they're fragmentary, and they're very biased. So again, archaeology is changing our picture of the late Iron Age.
It's very interesting that the context in which the report around Maiden Castle was written, as you say, the build up to a traumatic war. People are very interested in getting the message out there for archaeologists. I suppose TV has been tremendously important over the last 20 years. And as a TV producer, I love archaeology because there's always something to film and there's always a moment of discovery. And I remember asking producer John Hayes Fisher when he was going down to film with you, you know, what have you got? He's been down, he's recce'd, he's got some idea. And he said, you're going to love this. There's a guy buried on a bed of meat, the famous bed of meat. And you think, okay, well, I don't know where the story's going to go, but I know people are going to watch that program, a guy buried on a bed of meat. What did you make of them when they arrived down our team?
They're brilliant. I mean, what I've always loved TV archaeology. I think TV and archaeology, as you say, are a perfect combination. You know, as archaeologists, we are ultimately storytellers. We need to get our story out there. Otherwise, there's no point doing any archaeology. And something like Digging for Britain, I mean, we didn't know it at the time, but it's a fantastic program because it's a magazine of all the best things that are happening and the most interesting and the new discoveries. And what we liked was the fact that, you know, the team arrived, but they didn't dictate the story. They were they were sort of watching us do the excavations and do the work. So they weren't intrusive in that sense, but they were recording things as they happen. I know in subsequent series, you were sort of giving people dig diaries to record things as well, that moment of discovery and trying to capture that. So we're very sort of pleased in the sense that they were there, they were recording things, they were asking questions, but they weren't trying to get us to make the story more exciting. You know, they was recording it exactly objectively as it was. And of course, you came down on the days that we were finding those first few burials, and the burial lying face down on we keep calling it a bed of meat. I mean, it looks increasingly like it's a bed of bones because the bones themselves lying under the body seem to be defleshed. The meat's been taken off, but what we've got are a series of cow and horse bones which have been assembled in rough sort of anatomical order. And then we've got somebody, an individual who looks like they've been sacrificed. They have been deliberately killed and placed down onto that. So it's evidence of human sacrifice in the Iron Age. And we know that sort of activity is going on. I mean, the Romans talk about it all the time. They say Britons are terrible because they do this. You know, the Romans kill people, but they do it for fun. You know, that's different. That's for entertainment in the arena. Killing someone for religion is for the Romans' point of view, bad. But we do get evidence for that. You get lots of bog bodies. Lindau Man is another good example of someone who appears to have been sacrificed, and now he's on display in the British Museum. But this is one of the few examples we've got from southern Britain where that you've got clear-cut evidence that someone's life's been terminated with violence and they're placed in the pit as an offering to the gods. And it's something like that because, you know, a lot of things we find, we make links with the past. We say, well, they're just like us because they're farming, their food production and so on. But human sacrifice, that is something that we don't do and is frowned upon. And it does make that gap between us and them. And it's trying to understand, why would someone do this? How normal is this? What are they actually hoping to achieve? Again, these are all quite exciting things to ask about that period.
Absolutely. I think you put your finger on it, really. What I love about archaeology is how like us they are. You find something, a pot, or, you know, one of the most touching things was a grave with a clump of meadowsweet posed 3,000 years ago on the dead man's chest. And we found that about 2 years after I buried my dad. And I found that tremendously moving in the edit suite. And then you come across something that says, whoa, they were nothing like us. They were absolutely nothing like us. The Durotriges project just keeps finding stuff. Again, you know, you mentioned that you're not rescue archaeology, you're a long-running process. You don't turn up with 6 weeks or whatever to carry out your work. And that was something we hadn't even thought of, that we'd be able to go back to sites like you. We didn't think we'd be running for 13 years. We thought, you know, 3 or 4 years would be a good run on television. And I think we came back after 3 years and you'd found an entire village at that stage.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that was another quite an unusual or a surprising discovery in the sense that at that stage we were dealing with relatively small scale Iron Age farmsteads, and we were doing a little sort of drone survey That's one of the other sort of fantastic things about archaeology and archaeological detection. Over their period of sort of 15 years, technology has changed and developed so much. At the beginning, we were talking about planes flying over. Now we can control our own drones and look over the fields. But there's quite a lot of buried archaeological remains that when the crop's growing over, of course, if you've got a deep ditch, the crop appearing above it is going to be quite dark and lush. If it's crop growing above buried walls, it's going to be very stunted and appear quite white. And you fly across the site and suddenly you can see the archaeology laid out. And we were doing a drone survey across one of these fields, and for about 2 days, suddenly in the crop you could see loads and loads of what looked like Iron Age roundhouses and pits. And to begin with, we didn't believe what we were seeing because it looked like there were hundreds of these things. And the next year we did a geophysical survey when the crop had gone, and then we started trenching, and that was obviously when you came down again. And we were finding, I mean, in the 2 small trenches that we dug, we found about sort of 17, 18 Iron Age roundhouses, a real dense area of occupation. Of course, at this stage, we still don't know whether they're all broadly contemporary, but it was a completely and wholly unexpected find, because this wasn't a site that had a big rampart and ditch around. It wasn't a hill fort. It wasn't something that you could still see in the landscape today. And that's one of the problems, I think, in a place like Dorset. It's been so much farming going on. Lots of lesser sites have been levelled, and we're really drawn as archaeologists to hill forts and round barrows and things that are still obvious. And you miss in a field that looks completely flat and uninteresting. Suddenly there are hundreds of roundhouses, and you're dealing with a settlement whereby there are sort of multiple families. And really, I guess you could argue it's an early town. And something like that is completely and wholly unexpected. And again, it changes the whole perception about what's going on before the Romans arrive.
Mm. And then you mentioned the third and most recent time that digging came down, you'd found very high status female graves, which again is kind of changing how we might think of society in the past.
It is. I mean, again, going back to sort of how the Durotriges are represented, if you see any kind of reconstruction drawings of the tribe, it's always centered at hill forts. You get, I think, out of about 20, 25 reconstructions I've seen, they're all predominantly male warriors with blue woad, swords, naked, shields, shouting, angry, macho society, warrior society. And of course, our archaeological evidence is showing, well, actually, there's zero evidence for that whatsoever. So we really, need to redo those drawings and consider what were people trying to show in the 80s and 90s when they were putting these together. But society is very, very different to our general understanding of a heroic Celtic warrior society. It's nothing like that at all, and I think that's far more interesting.
So the dig season itself lasts a period of a couple of months in the summertime.
Yeah, we give our students 5 weeks solid excavation and training experience, but we have a few weeks at the beginning where we are sort of clearing the site up. We have a few weeks, about 4 or 5 weeks at the end, where with a number of people who stay on and with local volunteers, we sort of finish areas off. We do more geophysical surveys, and usually when the crops come off at the end of the summer, we do more surveys. So we're up there quite a lot. But there's usually a 5-week period in June and July where we're doing the intensive investigation work. And the last few years, we're finding lots and lots of these storage pits, these big cylindrical features going straight down into the chalk. And what we're finding about those is interesting, is that when every one of these goes out of use, I mean, it's the same with the character who we found lying face down in the bed of meat. They seem to have been cut primarily to store foodstuffs like grain. When they go out of use and they're deliberately backfilled, something is placed in the bottom of these bits. Sometimes it is a sacrificed human. Sometimes it's cow and horse remains that have been cut up and reassembled like a macabre jigsaw puzzle of body parts. Sometimes it's complete pots or quern, but they're making offerings, and it's giving us a whole sort of reference of ritual and religious activity that we haven't really found many other places. So that's what really takes up our time. And within the 5 weeks of our digging, often quite a few of those pits aren't finished. So our priority is to make sure we've got the pits dug and recorded, but more importantly of all, we've got to the bottom and we found out what placed ritual deposit is there, because every single deposit is different. And so everyone is vitally important.
It's not just digging though, is it, archaeology? I mean, what are you doing the rest of the year with your finds?
Of course, it isn't just digging. I mean, we do a lot of sort of survey work, identifying sites. We do lots of post excavation as well. So the finds ultimately come back to the university. The pottery is processed and washed. The artifacts, metal. If we don't get that many metal objects, but those we do are sort of conserved. The human remains are cleaned and assessed. All the finds ultimately are the property of the landowner, so they will go back to her eventually once we've studied them, with the exception of the human remains, which will either be reburied close to the site. I mean, that's our hopeful intention. We can't put them back in the same pits. Something about the 1857 Burial Act, we can't, having dug them up, we can't put them back, but we can bury them in a sort of a consecrated site nearby. And I would like to put them back as close to possible as the site that they were originally buried. But at the moment, they are housed at the university. But yes, for the rest of the year, we are looking at that material. Students do research projects on it. Some of them do dissertations on those material. But yeah, I guess a lot of people think archaeology is just the digging. And that's one of the things I love about Digging for Britain, is the sense that you don't just see the excavation. You do see people who are coming in with the finds and say, this is what we've studied. These are our conclusions change. You know, what you find on the day when the cameras are there and what you think of it will change after you've studied it and you've done some radiocarbon dating and you've assessed the environmental evidence. So that's what I love, about the program, is the sense that you do get that idea that work's continuous. The dig's ending, but the research on materials carries on. And really, so for the rest of the year, aside from teaching, we are continually studying, conserving, understanding this material and working towards publishing it and disseminating the results to the public.
And of course, the tools at your disposal keep changing. You've talked about LiDAR and drones, but I suppose possibly the biggest advances have been made in work on human remains and what we can discover about that.
It is. I mean, it's one of the, I don't know, it's a good thing or a bad thing about doing such a long-term project, is what we were able to do at the beginning has radically changed from what we can do now at the end. So it's not just the discovering and, you say, using LiDAR and using geophysics and drones, but yes, looking at the human remains and being able to look at the sort of isotope evidence to try and work out, things like trying to work out what is someone's diet. Are they eating predominantly meat or vegetables? A lot of the so-called elite burials that we're finding, they do seem to be consuming a heck of a lot of meat, much like you get with medieval, and later monarchs like Henry VIII was decidedly unwell because he never really ate vegetables. Vegetables are the poor man's food. He's just consuming large amounts of meat, which makes him very unhealthy. And we're seeing that on a lot of the skeletons that we're digging, is they don't seem to be consuming quite that much in the way of vegetable matters. The poorer burials certainly are, and to our perspective, they're probably a lot healthier because they've got a more varied diet. We're working out, there's no marine food in their diet at all. They're not eating fish. Even those sites close to the sea and close to rivers, they're not consuming fish. And that's might help us explain a bit more about the Iron Age, because we're finding lots of, anywhere you go across the country, there's lots of ritual and important Iron Age deposits in rivers. So perhaps they are thinking that their gods sort of live in the rivers, or the river is a passage to the underworld. You put things in it, but you don't take things out. You wouldn't dare eat a fish out of the river because it's part of that sort of divine world. And it's really interesting to see the evidence in the skeletons as well, that they are not consuming any kind of marine food. It's all terrestrial and it's predominantly meat. But again, looking at the isotopes, again, we're trying to work out whether people, looking at sort of the enamel and looking at sort of teeth evidence, did they grow up on the chalk? Have they migrated from somewhere else? Because that is one of the questions. The Durotriges tribe are so very different to the other Iron Age tribes of southern Britain. And is that different something that they created themselves, or whether did they develop somewhere like in central France and migrate over to Britain and take these culture traits with them? We know as the Roman Empire is spreading through Central Europe in the first century BC, lots of people are trying to escape. And so the Durotriges might be refugees. They might have migrated to Britain out of the way of the Romans. So all these things we're able to answer now by looking at the skeletal evidence.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of come full circle, really, back to Asterix. Did they come from France?
Yes.
So just a couple of last questions. Miles, put you on the spot. The greatest find or the greatest day out on the site for you?
I think the greatest find was probably when you were there with the cameras, that fortuitously finding that individual face down on the bed of bones. For us, that was an incredible find. Most of the finds that we are finding, it is those skeletal remains. It sounds really morbid, but when you find the body and you find the person that created these houses, created these finds, and you can interrogate the bones and you can find out more about their life. To us, given the paucity of burial remains anywhere else in the Iron Age across Britain, that is the most amazing discovery. And certainly that body face down, that human sacrifice, was probably the most explosive discovery, the most exciting than the one that we had made during our dig.
And of course, we were there, which made it all more exciting for us.
Even better.
Final question: why do we care? Why do we care about archaeology? I mean, we do, but why?
I mean, I'm probably the wrong person to ask because I'm so enthused by it continuously. But I think it's that trying to understand where we come from, trying to understand our past, trying to understand humanity. Is that sort of statement that those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. We are trying to understand history. We're trying to understand events. We're trying to understand society. It's every new archaeological discovery can completely change our understanding of the past, and it is that desire to discover it, is that sort of sense of inquiry. I mean, I personally don't understand people who don't have that sense of inquiry. I want to find out everything about the past, to find out how society got into this great big mess. Archaeology gives us that potential to understand that. So it's something I find exciting, and I'm very glad that it is a feature on television because it works so well there as a visual medium, getting that out there. And for people who can't come onto digs, showing them the excitement of discovery, showing them the real way in which artifacts are preserved in the ground. And Digging for Britain has really sort of gone a massive way in helping people understand the past and be enthused by it.
So Miles Russell, thank you very much for that deep dive into what makes an archaeologist tick, brought to you by the Content Club, a place where we're building a club where experts, history lovers, and TV producers make content in a different way. Thanks very much.